Today I want to talk about free will and predestination and the ultimate solution that I think fits those two pieces together. For a long time, these issues about free will and God's sovereignty have really bothered me. Does God will certain people to go to hell? Does he want people to be tormented forever? Did he want the devil to exist? Does he want evil to exist? And then on the free will side, other questions. Did God create people ahead of time knowing they would end up in hell? Things of this nature. And for a long time, I just found really no satisfying answers on the Calvinist side, the Arminian side, various other perspectives I found unsatisfying. I think I've finally arrived at a solution that gives me peace, that makes sense to me, that I think fits all the pieces together. In my last video, I discussed sort of one of the key problems that keeps this issue tangled is confusing the question of what free will is from the question of how free will works in salvation. You can ask, what is free will and how does it work with God's will? And that's a separate question from the questions about soteriology. How does salvation work with free will? Arminianism, Calvinism, those types of questions. So we need to separate those first. Today, I'm just going to be asking a very simple question about how free will works. What is free will? How does it work with God's will? This is not a specifically Christian question. A Jew, a Muslim could ask this question. It's just getting us the basic metaphysical understanding of what is free will. So let's start with the central problem. The central problem here is that a strong focus on sort of God's sovereignty. When you go that way and you get to determinism, it really explains God's knowledge, God's sovereignty, how he's in control of things, how he knows the future because he causes all of it. But it really struggles to explain human responsibility in any kind of meaningful way. And it seems to imply that God is the cause of evil, right? Because he's exhaustively causing everything. However, if you lean the other way, if you go the free will side, you lean into that, you wind up with other problems. You have no problem explaining how people are truly responsible because they have free will, or why evil exists, right? And God doesn't cause it. That makes a lot of sense. But you're going to have problems when it comes to first of all, God's sovereignty seems a little bit harder to explain, and even more so God's foreknowledge. Does he know ahead of time? Did he know ahead of time, for example, that the devil was going to sin and cause all this chaos? And if so, why did he still create him? Did God know ahead of time that what people were going to choose, whether certain people were going to choose to end up in hell? And if so, why did he create them? God's foreknowledge seems to make God responsible in the same kind of way. And so this is the central tension. And what I'm going to argue is that the fact that God is outside of time ultimately is going to solve this puzzle. It's going to reconcile these two pieces. It's going to allow us to have a God that's sovereign, knows everything, and genuinely allows for human freedom and responsibility. That's going to be what I'm going to argue. So we're going to walk through each of the different views, each of the different positions on free will, and I'm going to show you why I think they don't work and why we need this final view, which includes timelessness, to solve the problem. So the first view, determinism. This is also called exhaustive divine determinism. God decrees or causes every single thing that happens. Very straightforward. This has the problems we just discussed. It easily explains how God knows the future because God knows everything that's going to happen because he caused it that way, but it doesn't seem to explain free will. Free will is just an illusion or a figure of speech. It's not real. And then we should ask, well, what accounts for human responsibility? Why are humans really responsible for their actions? And even worse, doesn't it imply that God's responsible for evil in the most direct sense? I don't find this view satisfying. So moving on to the next view. The next view I'm calling naive libertarianism. So libertarianism holds to libertarian free will, meaning human beings they have genuine causal power over their own choices. They are the cause of their own choices. This is saying that humans in a limited sense are kind of first cause or prime mover when it comes to their choices. When you ask what ultimately caused someone to choose A rather than B, that person's own choice in their soul is the root of the explanation. It's a first cause. You can't ask what caused the first cause. There's no prior causes that determined it would be one way rather than the other. This is a little bit hard to grasp at first, but I think it's coherent, and I think everyone has to accept that this is at least in principle possible because of the nature of God. We believe that God is free in the ultimate sense, right? What caused God to create rather than not create? Couldn't he have done it differently? Couldn't he have created some other way rather than the way he actually did create? Most Christians would have to say, yes, God has real freedom. He could have created differently. But if he could have created differently, then we can just ask, well, what caused God to create this way rather than that. And it can't be anything outside of God himself, right? There's nothing outside of God himself which caused him to make creation this way rather than that. It's God in himself is the root of the explanation. He is the first cause in his will of the choice to do that this way rather than that way, right? So libertarian free will is, at least in principle, possible. And we would believe that a libertarian free will person would believe that since humans are made in the image of God, we in a limited way have a little piece of this libertarian free will. We have a little bit of free will in a limited way, just like God has free will. So another objection here is like, wait, if a free will choice is just uncaused, if it's not ultimately being determined by outside factors, then doesn't that mean it's just random? I don't think this follows. I think there's this assumption that either something is completely determined or else is random. And I think there's something in between, which we're calling free will. And I give the example of a jazz musician. By the way, sorry, I forgot to mention, I'm going to link in the description to my previous video explaining sort of the difference between the nature of free will and questions of soteriology. Everything I'm talking about today, these positions on free will, I wrote them down in a Substack article in more detail. So if you want more detail, I'll link that to the description below. I'm reading from my paper here. So this is a paragraph about how we can understand free will and the way it works. A jazz musician improvising does not play notes at random, yet neither is each note fully determined by a score or rule. His reasons, the key, the mood, the phrase he just played, his sense of what fits, genuinely shape and explain his choices without fully determining them. We do not say that his improvisation is unintelligible or random simply because another equally skilled musician might have made different choices in the same moment. The reasons constrain and illuminate the choice without collapsing into sufficient causes of it. So that's one way of understanding this. Another more nerdy way might be thinking of like probability distributions. They have some limits and constraints to them, yet the samples that you draw from them are not totally constrained by the probability distribution. That's a little bit more nerdy if you're into math. So we have limits on our constraints on what our free choices are, depending on our circumstances, our character, all these kinds of things. Yet we have some freedom, at least some of the time, right? Like a chess player has some moves some of the time, some options some of the time. There might be times when he has very limited moves or only one move, but that's the libertarian free will claim. So I'm calling this naive libertarian free will because this view doesn't make claims about God's knowledge. We're not explaining whether or not God knows the future. And we can just ask, does God know what free will creatures will choose ahead of time? If we say no, then we have open theism. If we say yes, then we have to ask, okay, could he have altered circumstances to yield a different choice? And then we have Molinism. So let's get into Molinism. Molinism is the view that people have libertarian free will. So they're truly the cause of their own choices. But God knows ahead of time what they would choose in any given circumstance. These are called the counterfactuals of freedom. I like to explain this using the example of Doctor Strange from Marvel Endgame. So in the movie, sorry, spoilers, Doctor Strange looks forward into millions of possible timelines and finds the one where the heroes win. And then he arranges circumstances so that that timeline actually happens. So that's kind of how we're seeing God. So God is not deciding what the possible timelines are, but he's making sure that the one that he thinks is good actually happens. This seems attractive at first because it sounds like it's balancing sovereignty and free will, but I think it collapses when you press on it. So the first problem is that it still leaves God with the ultimate responsibility for evil. If I have a dog on a leash and I know for a fact that if I let the leash go, the dog will run off and maul somebody, and then I still let the leash go knowing all this, and the dog actually goes and mauls somebody, doesn't that mean that I'm responsible for the mauling, right? The dog might be also responsible, but I'm responsible because I knew it was going to happen and I did it anyway. That's the position God is in Molinism. You still have this sort of, I guess, puppet master who's still manipulating things, but on the strings of circumstances instead of directly, like in determinism. I think this is problematic, and it leaves him with responsibility for evil. Then there's a worse problem, I think, for Molinism, which is, it's called the grounding problem. So let's imagine that all possible timelines, like a branching tree of every possibility. And imagine listing out every possible timeline on like a menu. Option 1, option 2, option 3, so on. Molinism is saying that God is choosing from this menu. He's choosing which timeline actually happens. Here's a question. Who makes the menu? Who decides what options are on the menu? Now you might be tempted to say, well, free creatures in their free will choices are making the menu. But that can't be, because first of all, God's choice is supposed to be happening before creation, before any of these creatures exist. And some of these creatures will never come to exist because they exist only in these hypothetical timelines that never happen. So can non-existent, hypothetical beings be responsible for the menu? I don't see how that can be the case. Some Molinists recognize this and they'll just say, well, look, the menu is sort of a brute fact, or rather a huge number of brute facts. They just are what they are, and God doesn't really cause them and he has no control of them. That's what it is. And that's just hugely problematic, because that means that God is no longer really the grounding of ultimate reality. He's no longer the cause of why our timeline and history has gone the way it's gone. There's a huge number of brute facts outside of God's control that God is not grounding. I'll put it this way. Who is greater? The one choosing from the menu, or the one making the menu, controlling what options go on and don't? Surely the person making the menu is greater. So whoever or whatever mysterious thing is sort of above God, limiting his options, is now greater than God in the Molinist view. And that's just a huge problem to me. All right, moving on. Libertarian open theism. So this view holds to libertarian free will plus open theism, meaning God does not exhaustively know the future. Now, the reason people land here is because they recognize that if God has this exhaustive foreknowledge, it creates these problems. You end up with Molinism, and you end up with all the problems that Molinism has. So if you're going to reject that view, you end up with this idea that God doesn't exhaustively know the future. Maybe he plans really well, but he still doesn't ultimately know what's going to happen. I think this view is simple and very coherent, but I just think it's not an option for Orthodox Christians. It makes God less than the greatest conceivable being. He's fundamentally then contingent and changeable, and he can be surprised. He can be genuinely surprised at what happens. And I don't think he can really meaningfully be sovereign in that case. And I just think it goes against the entire Christian tradition up until recent times. God has been regarded as being exhaustively knowing the future. It really makes a mess of that if we deny this. All right, the next view is compatibilism. So this view says that free will and determinism are compatible. And there are a few ways to understand this. This view sort of presents itself as some kind of compromise, some kind of soft determinism, but I don't think that's really true. I think when you press on it, it collapses back into that hard determinism that we were talking about at the beginning. So the first kind of compatibilism sort of just tries to play semantic games and redefine free will to mean something else. Oh, free will just means that you're doing what you want, you're following your desires, even though your desires are entirely determined. Something like this, and you see various versions of this. And just frankly, I just find all of that dishonest. Just call a spade if free will is ultimately an illusion and I'm ultimately being controlled by things outside of my control, then just say that. Say free will is an illusion, doesn't ultimately exist, it's not real. Don't play semantic games to try and redefine it or make it work. A more sophisticated version, so that's sort of a naive version. A more sophisticated version of compatibilism comes from Thomas Aquinas. So he's going to suggest in Thomism, he's going to suggest that we have this radical dependence on God, this radical ontological dependence on God. We are being sustained in our entire reality. We're being sustained by God moment to moment. The way that a video game and a video game world is being sustained moment to moment by the video game console or the computer that's running the game, right? You could also think of a book and the author. So the book world is entirely the product of the mind of the author, right? It's generated by him. And so it would be a mistake, it would be a category error to ask, say in Lord of the Rings, whether it's Frodo that destroys the ring or whether it's Tolkien, the author, that destroys the ring. Well, it's both, right? It's Frodo from within the book reality that's doing it. But it's, or I guess Gollum, again, spoilers. But it's Tolkien from the outside perspective, because he's the author, he's causing all things in the book. So I generally agree that God sustains reality. I don't have any problem with that. But I just don't think this ultimately solves this problem with determinism and free will. It just doesn't. So let's zoom into layer 2. Let's zoom into our created reality. Let's grant that there are these two layers. Zooming into layer 2. Our created reality. What actually causes a person to choose A rather than B? What causes that? A traditional Thomist, someone following Aquinas, would say, well, a person chooses the option that their intellect perceives as being better. Okay, but that just invites regress. So what causes that person's intellect in that moment to perceive A rather than B as being better? And you can keep asking this question. And in the end, either that choice is entirely determined by factors outside of that person's control. It's determined. We have determinism again, right? Or that person is genuinely contributing something of their own. In other words, they have libertarian free will. And the choice is not determined, right? So one of two options. If you choose the determinist option, then we are back to all the problems with determinism and divine responsibility for evil and so on. If you choose the libertarian option, well, then that's fine. But I think we no longer meaningfully have compatibilism. The whole point of compatibilism is that free will is compatible with determinism. And we no longer have determinism if you also have libertarianism. So yeah, that's why I don't find that view coherent. All right, finally, here comes the view that I hold. I'm calling this timeless libertarianism. Timeless libertarianism. This is also called Boethianism, following St. Boethius from the 5th century. This is his view. And it's also the view of C.S. Lewis. So the way it works is like this. Libertarian free will exists. People are the cause of their own choices. But God is outside of time, and he knows all of history exhaustively. The way that you know the present moment, just like I'm aware of the present moment, that's the way in which God is outside of time and is seeing all of history at once. And so the key move here is that our free choices come logically prior to God's knowledge of them, just like open theism. But unlike open theism, since God is timeless and outside of time, he sees all of our choices at once. He sees all of history at once, and he knows everything at the same time. And there's no moment at which God lacks the knowledge and then acquires it. He always knows what we do because he always sees it. So again, we're drawing this analogy between God's perception of all of time and the way I perceive the present moment. In the present moment, there are some things that I cause, right? Like my hand moving. And there are some things that I observe without causing. So God can observe things in all of time without causing them. He can genuinely allow there to be real free will and know about what the outcome of those choices is without causing those choices directly. So I tend to think of this in 3 layers. So there's layer 1. Layer 1 is sort of God's sovereign decision. He sets up the whole menu of possible good timelines in advance with real limits and boundaries on what choices are available. He's setting up this menu of options. Wherever there's a free choice, God sovereignly decided that it should be there and what its limits should be. So freedom is the sovereign gift of God. Layer 2 are people's actual free choices in time. So as we move through time, we actually make choices. We're deciding among these timelines which way that the reality is going to go as we choose things. Layer 3 is God's knowledge of what people actually choose in layer 2, derived by observing layer 2 from his vantage point outside of time. So you picture God in layer 3 observing layer 2 and seeing what people actually choose, but from his outside of time eternal vantage point. I want to give a concrete example here from the book of Esther. So Mordecai says to Esther, "If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance from the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish." So notice that there's 2 genuine possibilities, but there are real limits and constraints. So the Jews will be saved either way. Whatever Esther does, Jews are going to be saved. Deliverance will arise from another place, right? This is God's sovereign limitation. Think about layer 1. So all good timelines from that point forward contain salvation for the Jews. However, there's genuine choice and genuine possibility, right? In layer 2, Esther gets to decide whether she's going to participate in the salvation of the Jews or whether she's going to reject that and she and her family are going to perish. So that's genuine choice, genuine responsibility. Now in layer 3, we get God's knowledge of what Esther actually chooses. That's layer 3. He knows this by seeing it from his eternal vantage point. He knows what she chooses, not because he decreed it, but because he sees her choosing it. And he sees her choosing it from all eternity because he's outside of time. So this is a little bit confusing to grasp, but I hope I'm making sense here. Let's see how this compares to other views. So compared to Molinism, there's no grounding problem. God isn't picking from a menu that someone else wrote. He wrote the menu. This is why I think of this view sort of as like reverse Molinism, right? Versus determinism, God doesn't force the choice. He just knows about it, right? And compared to open theism, God doesn't lack the knowledge of the future. He's not in the dark and waiting because there's no later for him, right? He always has the view. He always has the eternal view of all of time, right? But he sees it, he doesn't cause it, and that's important. The biggest challenge to this view is just from those who deny divine timelessness. They'll just say, well, God isn't outside of time. People like William Lane Craig. I just don't accept that. I would just say that divine timelessness has been the vast majority view throughout Christian history. I would say you'd be foolish to just dismiss divine timelessness as a live option. I think it's the majority option as far as I can tell. And I think we have like empirical reason to believe that God is outside of time. Nowadays, Big Bang cosmology has shown that time and space themselves had a beginning. They began. That means that whatever kind of thing God is, he's outside of time and space. So God is timeless in his nature. And I think it makes a lot of sense to say that God is timeless. All right. So summarizing, Notice how this has gone. When we start from the free will side and we press hard into free will options, we run into problems with God's knowledge. Either he doesn't know what people will freely choose ahead of time, and we end up with open theism, which is not an option for Christians. If he does know what people will do ahead of time, we end up with Molinism. So we still have a God who is sort of manipulating everything, a puppet master who puppets them on the strings of circumstance. He's manipulating everything through circumstances, and that leaves him responsible for evil. And he's now limited by a menu of options determined by who knows what. Molinists don't have an explanation for that. But if we start on the determinist side, right, we have no good way to account for human responsibility or divine causation of evil. And if we try to sort of soften determinism by moving to compatibilism, we really have no way to explain how it's fundamentally different from determinism. It ends up just collapsing back into that hard determinism that doesn't work. The only way to coherently hold all these three in tension, God's sovereignty, man's genuine free will and responsibility, and then God's exhaustive knowledge, is timeless libertarianism. This view I've been describing. God determines what possibilities there are, what limits there are to human freedom. People in time actually choose things, and God eternally sees it from his vantage point outside of time. Hope this makes sense. I want to note one final thing. I have not gotten to views of soteriology, Calvinism, Arminianism, how salvation works, these kinds of things. So far, we're just talking about the nature of time and the nature of free will. Notice that if you adopt timeless libertarianism, that doesn't commit you to one particular soteriological view. You could still say, you could be a Calvinist and say that God limits freedom such that, or depravity limits freedom such that you don't actually have choices in matters related to salvation. You have free will choices in other arenas, just not in matters related to salvation, and you can still be a Calvinist. Or you could be an Arminian or some other option. So we haven't made determinations about soteriology. I'm going to get to that in my video next week. But for now, we've just established a baseline of what is free will, what does it mean, and how does it work with God's own will and God's knowledge. So hopefully this makes sense. Like and subscribe if you like my video, and see you guys next week.